my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. So, good morning. I am Ginevra Busacca, and I'm the first speaker of the proposition in this debate. In the motion, this House believes that the UN Security Council should be abolished in favor of the existence of only the General Assembly as it is now. So, throughout my speech, I will first give my team's definition. I'll explain the theme, then our team's line, and then I will present our first argument. So now allow me to give a definition of this motion. Firstly, we have UN Security Council. It has primary responsibility to make resolutions and to adopt binding measures for the maintenance of international peace and security. It is made up of 5 permanent countries that have a veto power and are the US, the UK, France, Russia and China, and 10 rotating countries re-elected every 2 years. They assess threats to international security, including civil wars, natural disasters, arms, proliferation and terrorism. UN General Assembly. It is a deliberate policy-making representative organ of the UN. Each of its 193 member states has 1 vote. It provides a forum for multilateral discussions and makes recommendations about international issues, including peace and security, development, disarmament, human rights, and international laws. To abolish, which means to put away, eliminate, and as it is now, which means without changing any of its methods, roles, and structure. So, for this debate, the main question, the theme that we're going to discuss today, is whether the UN Security Council is fit or not for the purpose of maintaining peace and safety all around our globe, or if it's actually ineffective and unsuitable for the current geopolitical situation and for maintaining this role, and if this function of peacekeeping and safety should be carried out instead by the General Assembly. So, our team's line, accordingly, is that the Council, we believe strongly that the Council is not democratic enough, not representative enough, and is not a disinterested nor a political institution, especially because of its 5 permanent members that impede the UN's ability to take strong actions, to condemn and stop wars, or to resolve the multitude of crises and violations it faces because of their veto power that is used to defend their national interests. So no thanks, later. So we believe that the Security Council should be abolished in favor of the General Assembly, that with its more democratic methods can address some of today's most complex and dangerous issues better, more effectively and collectively. The point?
And who would take the decisions that are taken in the Security Council?
The General Assembly. So, the values that we want to defend in our team, the proposition, are values of peacekeeping, security and democracy, and especially equity and shared policymaking. So now we can go on with the first argument. Our first argument is that we believe that the UN Security Council is unrepresentative and undemocratic. The Security Council fails to represent the international community because of geopolitical shifts that have empowered nations that were not even on the map when the United Nations were created, and especially because of the overrepresentation of Western countries in the Security Council that do not reflect the situation of the 21st century nor the geopolitical diversity that we have in the UN. The UN Security Council is not democratic because democracy has 1 fundamental characteristic, and that is that all the subjects involved must be equals and share the decision-making. Yes?
Are you aware that democracy means that the population is represented rather than the will of their representative?
Sure, but when we say populations, we mean all populations. We cannot represent all the populations if only 15 countries hold more power over the other 193 members of the UN. So, let's move on. This is exactly what I'm going to talk about today. Because of the permanent 5 members that are able to use their veto power to override any decision that comes to the UN, this is not a democratic system. Basically, this means that only 1 no vote from one of those 5 permanent states means that any decision that is proposed to the Security Council can sink, can completely not be, in any case, discussed anymore. So this gives significant influence over global decision-making to those only 5 countries without holding them accountable enough to the broader international community. The Security Council is called Security Council, but actually it does not represent security to its full meaning. Security does comprehend in itself other things like inclusion, cohesion and integration, a sense of belonging to the society, an international order that is based on fairness and respect for human rights. During the decades, people have tried to find solutions to obviously not give all this power to those 5 permanent states, but none of those has worked. Like, for example, the expansion of the council. No formula for expansion has been acceptable for the possible opposition from any of the country members. And moreover, adding members would also make the Council basically the same as the General Assembly. So it will be completely useless. So we believe that it's better that the UN General Assembly is instead universally representative and is actually used to maintain this role of peacekeeping and safety. Because in the General Assembly, each UN member state gets 1 vote and has an equal voice. This is much more democratic compared to the Security Council. The General Assembly, with its broader membership, can address all the issues collectively. Obviously, we have evidences that back this reasoning up. We have stated that in percentages, only the 7.5% of the world is represented in the Security Council, because only 15 members of the Security Council of the UN are part of the Security Council. And even if there are 2 countries that rotate every 2 years, the possibility at a percentage of being part of those 2 countries that rotate is about 0.05%. That is a very low percentage. Plus, observer states do not have any voting rights. So even if the decisions that the Security Council is making is about another member state, they cannot intervene, even if the decision is against them. And so they just have to accept it, which is not right. And then the veto power, as we have discussed today, that is mentioned in the Article 27, Chapter 1 of the United States, means that the Security Council will never be able to take actions against those 5 permanent countries. And this is used many times by the USA, for example, to protect the interests of its ally, Israel, or where China vetoed India's movements against Pakistan-based terrorism. The General Assembly is much better as it has for its center debate, and so it gives voice to each country. Another example is the Action for Peacekeeping initiative launched by the Secretary General in March that asked all the members to revitalize peacekeeping with improvements to operation and strengthen partnerships, which means that the General Assembly truly has at its heart peacekeeping. So to link it all back, we have demonstrated to this reasoning and through these evidences that the General Assembly is a much better fit as it represents more democratically everyone in the UN, and it's better for decision making. So with that, I end my speech.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, I am Simona Botta, the first speaker of the opposition team. And today we are debating about the Security Council, the General Assembly and the UN, and the role of the UN, which is the only global governance that we have right now. And by following the model proposed by the proposition team, so by abolishing the Security Council, what would we have? The UN would become a weak global governance, because the Security Council is the only organ which has the executive power, which has the power to actually act in the world, to be active in the world. I would like to continue by saying that we agree with the definitions given by the proposition team, but we would like to add one thing to the definition of the UN Security Council. In fact, it does not only tries to maintain peace, but it takes the lead in determining the existence of a threat to the peace or act of aggression. And we would like to continue with saying that the proposition team defined as it is now, the General Assembly remaining it as it is now, by saying that nothing would change, so the powers of the General Assembly would remain the same. But then, when we asked the POI who would take the Security Council decisions, well, they replied by saying that the General Assembly would do that in this case, but the General Assembly does not have the power to do that, because the General Assembly is only, just a second, is only a deliberative organ. It is not an executive organ. Yes?
Are you aware that the Security Council is not a legislative body either, so its executions are not binding and countries can still decide not to follow them?
Well, no, the Security Council is not a legislative organ, it is an executive organ. And what are the main methods of action that it can use? For example, it can impose sanctions, or it can authorize the use of force. And in fact, I'm going to talk about all the missions that are going on, that have been finished and that have been completed over the years since its creation in 1945. And I would like to continue by saying that the problem of not enough representation in the Security Council is not actually present, because the 10 members that are elected by the General Assembly, first of all, are elected by the General Assembly, so they are elected by the global population. It is, yes, an indirect representation, but it's still democratic. And second of all, they are elected from all countries. For example, there are 4 countries that are elected from the African continent. There are 3 countries that are elected from the eastern part of the world, so there is a representation of the population. No, thank you. And I would like to continue and to finish my part of rebuttal by saying that the resolutions which were vetoed over the years, so since the creation of the Security Council, are only the 10% of the resolutions which are presented. So, we believe that the UN Security Council should not be abolished, because in this way the UN, the only global governance we have, would remain weak and would not work anymore. And we believe that this is not possible and this is not favorable considering our situation. What is our situation? Well, the situation we are in right now is a critical one, because the number of conflicts have grown by 40% in only the last 3 years, as stated by the Conflict Index edited by ICLED. There are 55 ongoing wars nowadays, as stated by the Italian Parliament. But the number is not the only important fact we have to take into account. It is also the how. In fact, the proposition team stated that the world in which we are right now does not see the 5 big powers as the only ones. And this is true. The world before the Cold War and during the Cold War was a bipolar world, with the Soviet Union on one hand and the USA on the other. While right now the world can be considered multipolar. In fact, there are many superpowers in the world. And the battles have changed, because battles are not so direct anymore. Guerrilla warfare, terroristic attacks, sabotages are the main methods of warfare. And in this multipolar world, chaos is a consequent condition, and the UN Security Council is the only one which can control this chaos. And in fact, we believe that this is not the right moment to abolish the Security Council for 3 main reasons. Because it is the only executive organ, because it is a protection from corruption, and because it can save the world from chaos. No, thank you. First of all, it is the only UN's executive organ. As I said, it can impose sanctions, it can authorize the use of force, for example, the blue helmets, which are the forces of the UN. and it has helped to maintain peace for almost 80 years since its creation. Let me give you a few examples. When in Haiti the takeover in 1991 happened, the Security Council sent UN troops to guarantee help during this situation and to stabilize the situation afterwards. And even when the rebellion of 2004 happened, they still sent troops and they helped the situation until 2018. Or to help the situation in Burundi, when the civil war that broke out caused 300,000 deaths, as reported by the BBC. And in 2000, the Security Council started the mission ONUB to help the situation, which then ended in 2007. Or more recently, in Lebanon, although it started in 1978, nowadays the mission UNIFIL still continues and still goes on and still counts 12,000 units operating, which help the situation, which give humanitarian help to the people involved in the war. Another example is the ongoing mission AMIS in South Sudan from 2011 to consolidate peace and to help the country to become independent. Or lastly, the mission in Cyprus, the UNFICYP, which started in 1964 and then is still continuing nowadays. And these are only a few examples of when the UN actually helped the situations and actually, demonstrated that it is crucial, that its presence is crucial. So our question is, without the Security Council, with only the General Assembly as it is now, so without the executive power, who would act to maintain peace? Who would control the blue helmets? The answer is no one, because the General Assembly as it is now has not the power to do so. And this is the moment in which we absolutely need the presence of the Security Council, not only an organ which discusses matters. We need action. So we believe that the Security Council should not be abolished, considering our situation, because it is the only executive organ, because it is a protection from corruption, and because it can save the world from chaos. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. So my speech will start in three, two, one. All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Eleonora, and I'm proudly standing as the second speaker for the proposition team. Throughout my speech, I will first reinforce what my teammate has said, then I will refute what the opposition has said, and I'll move on to our other two arguments. Now, a couple of main points have emerged from their argumentations. The first one is that the Security Council holds executive power, but we want to highlight how that is not correct. We need to take into account how the Security Council, as I've already said, is not a legislative body. Because of this, the recommendations and the regulations and resolutions they carry out are not binding. What does this mean? This means that some countries are still free not to follow them. The Security Council does not hold the real power to impose these resolutions, and because of this, states can still disobey them. Moreover, the speaker has stated how now there is more representation, but we still need to consider. Yes.
So would the General Assembly have executive power?
The General Assembly still would not have executive power, but it doesn't really matter because the General Assembly has the main function of carrying out recommendations with the agreement of all states. This way there is a higher chance they will actually follow these recommendations as they all agree on this. Now, as I was saying, representation is still not enough. The 10 countries who still contribute to the Security Council, with the 5 main ones, are temporary and just a very small percentage of all all the countries that are part of the General Assembly and of the UN in general. It is still not enough. Not to mention that the global powers around the world are no longer two like it was in the past, but there's still very few. We have America, China, Russia. That's pretty much it. There are also plenty of examples where the Security Council has failed in its mission to actually carry out peacekeeping operations, and we'll have plenty of examples to show this. The ones you are shown are just a couple of ones. They are marginalized and not enough in comparison with the countless times. No, thank you. With the countless times the Security Council has failed, which brings us exactly to our second argument. Our second argument is that the Security Council has failed to meet its mandate. Throughout its entire history, there have been many diplomatic setbacks which have caused the Security Council to fail in its fundamental objective, maintaining peacekeeping and security. This is mainly because the main countries, the ones that hold the veto power, only for the most of the time work in their personal benefit, for the benefit either of themselves or of their allies. This has caused that most of the time, or at least sometimes, they have supported war of aggressions, of oppressions for their own interests. Yes?
Are you saying that for some times in which the UN, the Security Council didn't act, we should abolish the whole organ?
What we're going to show is that these are not just a few isolated cases. Throughout its entire history, up to nowadays in our current war, there are still examples of the Security Council not being able to carry out its duties for its own interest. Moreover, most of the main countries that are part of the Security Council right now are encouraging these wars by increasing the amount of weapons they are producing and exporting. This creates a huge threat to general peace all around the world. The General Assembly, on the other hand, can use the Uniting for Peace resolution, which means that when the Security Council very often fails to meet its mandate, the General Assembly can step in and recommend the use of recommend the use of sanctions or of military force in order to establish orders. Now, to move on to some cases in which the Security Council has failed, let's take some current ones like the war going on between Russia and Ukraine. Because of the veto power held by Russia, the Security Council has not been able to stop this war, and it is still ongoing as we're speaking. Another example of this is the war between Palestine and Israel. Because of America's personal interest in this conflict, they have imposed a veto power that has stopped military forces from acting out and helping these countries. But let's think about some examples in the past, like the Kashmir dispute or the Darfur conflict in Sudan. These conflicts which have brought the deaths of countless of people, of hundreds of thousands of people, could have easily been resolved and prevented if the Security Council had been able to agree on some principles and how to act out for the general good, as it is supposed to do, but it doesn't. So, to link it all back, we believe that the Security Council should be abolished because it has failed to meet its main objective, peacekeeping. Now, to move on to our third case, instead, we argue that we want to make a comparison between the Security Council policy of selective security against the General Assembly's broader action. The UN has accepted the concept of negative peace to a positive one. What does this mean? It means that peacekeeping does not just involve avoiding wars, but it also means to eliminate all possible elements that could lead to wars and similar conflicts, such as the violation of human rights or personal freedom. However, the Security Council holds the... Yes?
Are you aware that the peacekeeping, which are sent in the workplaces by the Security Council, also helps with humanitarian support, so the Security Council actually meets?
Yes, but of course, I'm not saying that theoretically, it does not. But we need to take into account, as I was saying, that the Security Council's members hold the discretionary power. It means that they can decide what actually poses a threat to general peacekeeping and what does not. And there have been many examples in which they have manipulated this power for their own interests, creating a bias and not interfering in situations when they should have had for their own personal gain. Whereas the General Assembly takes on a broader view of maintaining this peace. There have been many, in fact, the General Assembly acts out in a context of taking into account not just peacekeeping per se, but also social aspects, cultural aspects, economical aspects, and so on. In cases of conflicts, if the General Assembly recognizes fundamental human rights have been violated, then it affirms this, it carries out recommendations, and it encourages countries to take countermeasures in order to resolve this conflict. There have been many occasions in which the General Assembly has contributed to peacekeeping, like in the 60s, 80s, and 70s of the last centuries, where it has helped Africa free itself from apartheid, or it has helped in freeing Portuguese from its state of oppression. Not to mention, it has also helped in the Syrian conflict and in the Korean Civil War. So, to link it all back, we believe that the Security Council should be abolished in favor of the General Assembly because of its broader view in maintaining peacekeeping and a positive one as well. With that, I conclude my speech.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, I'm Erika Gallo, the second speaker of the opposition team. First of all, I'd like to rebut a few things that the proposition team has said. First of all, they said that the Security Council doesn't have the legislative power, and that is true, but we always sustained that it had the executive power, which the General Assembly does not have. The General Assembly can only have a moral suasion and can encourage countries to do something, but does not have the power to impose it. Also, the Security Council can authorize the use of force, can give sanctions, and can send blue helmets. So it can do a lot more than the General Assembly. They also said that the decisions taken in the General Assembly are more democratic because all the countries agree with those decisions. However, that is incorrect, because to take a decision no, thank you. To take a decision in the General Assembly, only 2/3 of the countries' consent is necessary. Therefore, not all countries agree with the decisions. No, thank you. Also, they said that the Security Council has failed in peacekeeping operations. And that might be true in some cases. In some cases, it has failed, but it also did not fail in many other cases. And that is really important, because having some operations that are successful is much better than not having any operations at all, because the General Assembly does not have the power to do it, while the Security Council, while the Security Council does have the power to do it. Yes, please.
Are you aware that the decisions in the Security Councils are taken by a vote, whereas in the General Assembly they're taken by general consensus? So the General Assembly takes into account more points of view in order to get everyone to agree, instead of the Security Council who uses a vote.
As I said before, in the General Assembly also the decisions are voted, and they reach an agreement when 2/3 of the General Assembly agrees, not all of them. And as I was saying, it's much better to keep the Security Council, because it might fail in some cases, but it's better to be successful in not all cases, but at least in some, while the General Assembly cannot assure that. They also said, in fact, that millions of deaths could have been saved. That's true. Other millions of deaths could have been saved. However, with the General Assembly, none of those millions of deaths could be saved, because the General Assembly does not have the power to do anything that the Security Council can do. Therefore, abolishing the Security Council is not the right decision. No, thank you. Also, they said that the Security Council can decide what is a threat and what is not. That is true, but that's actually an advantage because the General Assembly cannot do that. So my question is, who would actually decide what is a threat and what is not? Nobody, because the General Assembly does not do that. But now I will also start to explain our last two arguments and why do we believe that the Security Council should not be abolished. So basically, we explained in our first argument why it shouldn't be abolished, but it goes even more deeper than that. Because what would actually happen if the Security Council was abolished? Unlike the proposition team, we think that it won't benefit representativeness, but it would only foster corruption. And why is that? That's because in the General Assembly, each country has a vote, and each country can speak for the same amount of time. Therefore, each country has the same importance, that's sure. But what would happen once the Security Council was abolished? The balance of forces of the world would foster the acquisition of consent with treaties. And what would it mean? It means that the most powerful and wealthiest countries would buy the votes or greatly influence the poorer ones. And that has actually happened also in the past. For example, with the Marshall Plan, which was an initiative done by the USA in the 1948 to provide foreign aid to Western Europe. In this way, USA bought the dominance and alliance with Europe. In fact, a year later, the North Atlantic Alliance was formed, but that's not the only one example. In fact, the term client state, a state that is economically, politically, and militarily subordinated to a more powerful controlling state, has been used several times throughout history. One example is during the Cold War, when Soviet client states included much of the Warsaw Pact member states or other nations with Marxist-Leninist governments. And their policies have been heavily influenced by Soviet military power, and they were given economic aid. But also some Latin American countries were considered to be client state of the USA. On the other hand, no thank you. On the other hand, this wouldn't happen in the Security Council. And that's because the most powerful and wealthiest countries, such as the USA and Russia, have the veto power. This means they wouldn't have any interest in making such alliances. But even if they did, one of the 5 permanent members would use the veto power, which is not present in the General Assembly. This means that abolishing the Security Council would only foster corruption. But there's also another reason why the Security Council should not be abolished. And we can do an analogy with the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the first worldwide intergovernmental organization, and its principal mission was to maintain peace, just like the UN. And it was founded in the 1920 by the Paris Peace Conference, and that ended World War I, and it ceased operation in 1946. But why has it failed? It failed because there wasn't a clear executive order with effective governance tool. Therefore, no important decision was ever made. On the other hand, the Security Council offers the actual possibility to achieve a compromise, make decisions and solutions, even if each country continues to pursue their own interests. For example, we can think about the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq in 1990, when the Security Council approved 2 resolutions, one that condemned the invasion and also required the Iraqi troops to withdraw, and the second one approved economic sanctions against Iraq. But let's suppose that the Security Council was abolished. What would be the result? Well, we would be living in the world described by Orwell in 1984. In this book, as we all know, there are 3 major countries, and there isn't a clear and legally established organization. Therefore, as countries always want to pursue their own interest, they continuously change alliances, but there is a constant state of war. And that is exactly the world we would be living in if the Security Security Council was abolished. Therefore, we are against the abolishment of the Security Council because it's the only executive organ, it is a protection from corruption, and it can save the world from chaos. Thank you.
I will begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, dear judges and dear opposition team. I'm Martina, and I'm proudly standing as the third speaker of the proposition in this debate. Throughout my speech, I will refute everything that the opposition has said so far, and I will link our team's argument back to our line. So, two main points of clash have emerged during the debate that I would like to address, and those are that of diversity inside the United Nations and that of the division of powers and what powers and functions the singular members have. So let me begin by discussing that of diversity. The first speaker of the opposition has stated that the Security Council offers diversity with the use of rotations inside the 10 non-permanent members. However, the 10 countries elected by the General Assembly do not offer enough representation as we have contended, because the states are elected taking into account the current geopolitical status of the world, meaning that some states will be elected many times in a row even, and some will never have been elected. Some states have never been elected inside the 10 non-permanent members. Therefore, how could all states be represented if some have not even elected? This is the problem of diversity, and that is what we have been tackling with our arguments by proving that the General Assembly would offer a more diverse idea of the situation that is being discussed. We also discussed with the second speaker of the opposition that the General Assembly needs 2/3 of the votes. Therefore, a consensus will not be reached. Therefore, not all states would have to agree to take the decision. The thing is, the Security Council doesn't need full agreement of all the 15 countries. Only 9 of them have to be okay with the resolution, and 5 of those have to be the permanent members. The proportion still stands, but a discussion leading to a 2/3 consensus between 193 countries is meant to offer more diverse insight, ideals, and thorough participation than only that of the Security Council. Yes, please.
Decision made by the UN General Assembly isn't executive, how would it be effective?
I will come to that in a second. Thanks for the POI. Now I would like to move on to our other important point of clash, perhaps the most important of the debate, which is that of the division of powers. The opposition has stated their arguments by basing themselves on a principle, which is that the General Assembly does not have executive power. Therefore, the entire United Nations will be rendered useless if the Security Council was abolished, because they could not be taking any binding measures. The thing is, we contend that the Security Council is useless in this case because the United Nations are in fact united. They are an agreement of states. If the decision taken by the General Assembly takes 2/3 of the consensus, not respecting that decision will put you against the 193 states. It will still make you an enemy of the other states, not respecting it, even though it is not legally binding, as we said, or even if some states refuse to follow the Security Council measures. That of the General Assembly are actually more diverse, as we've said, and they offer a more, they allow for the United Nations to be more cooperative rather than a system of hierarchical states that govern over the others. Okay. I would like to address another thing that the second speaker of the opposition has stated in regards to the problem that would emerge if the power went to the General Assembly, which is that corruption will become a more significant issue as states want to find alliances to ensure the votes of some states or some not. If that was the case, no decision ever taken by the General Assembly would be democratic, because even in the past, important decisions that were not military have been taken. Where was that corruption? That all of those decisions will be rendered useless because then states will have alliances, and that will make the General Assembly at all useless. The Security Council does not need corruption, as the opposition has stated, but that's because they already make the decisions. They do not need to make alliances simply because they all have the power. We have presented as evidence the fact that the ceasefire that was presented to Israel was not respected, and at first it was even blocked by the United States. There is no corruption needed for that to happen to Israel, simply because the United States are allied with Israel, and the veto that was put to block the resolution was enough to stop it. Therefore, the fact that corruption might happen in the General Assembly will not make it any less democratic than the Security Council. If anything, the power that these 5 states have is not only anachronistic, because it is anachronistic, they were elected after the Second World War, but it is also not democratic and not powerful enough to make the resolutions happen, to make everything fall apart perfectly. Okay, I would now like to rethink about what we have presented as a team. I would like to say that we presented arguments to support the fact that the Security Council is not democratic, it is not powerful, it is not enough to support the geopolitical position that we have right now. Our first speaker has said thoroughly and has presented through evidence that there is not enough representation inside the Security Council. It is not enough. Some states cannot have a voice, cannot have a say in the decision-making of military actions. Whereas by abolishing the Security Council, every state will have a voice. Everybody will be able to express their opinion. And states will find more cooperation by using this kind of system to elect the votes. Well, our second speaker has stated that the Security Council has failed to meet its mandate, and we've seen it with countless evidence, both recent and in the past. And I could offer some more. Like, we have talked in this debate about the creation of the United for Peace, the resolution from the General Assembly, which in itself is proof of the malfunctioning of the Security Council. Why would such thing even be needed if the Security Council always met its mandate? No, this was created because sometimes the Security Council takes slow decisions. It hesitates in putting work into. Yes, please.
Don't you think that with 193 states rather than 15, the decision would be even slower?
The vote is still won. Everybody has time to make the decisions, right? There is still time that needs to be taken into account, both for the Security Council and for the General Assembly. But the vote still needs to happen for both. While 15 states will take more time to put things into action because of the veto power, the General Assembly will not have this kind of thing as an obstacle, and they could just vote. They could put into the decision and talk to each other to make the decision. As I was saying, the Security Council has failed to meet its mandate, and the United for Peace is evidence for that. It was created, I will bring another example of this, because the USSR at the time kept on prolonging the block of attacks to South Korea from North Korea, making it inefficient, and therefore the United for Peace was created to override the Security Council, giving, in this case, executive power to the General Assembly. This is one of the few cases right now where it could happen, but it is binding as the Security Council. Lastly, our third speaker has stated that the policy of security, the policy of selective security is worse than the GA's broader action, and that is what we've been trying to prove with our evidence, with our arguments. Generally, to link everything back to our line, I would like to say that the Security Council is not democratic, it is not representative, it is too much, it is slow. We have proven with evidence and arguments that it is slow, inefficient, and just rendered useless in today's over-advancing world. And instead, what we need is collaboration. What we need is communication. What we need is democracy. And that is what the General Assembly only could bring to the world. With that, I conclude my speech. Thank you for listening.
Okay, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Good morning, everybody. I'm Sara Tupino, and I'm the third speaker of the opposition team. I first would like to start my speech by saying that the proposition team did not engage at all with the reality of facts that we brought in our first argument. My teammate Simona explained that we should not abolish the Security Council as it is the only executive organ of the UN. And we supported this because of the reality of facts that affects the world we live in today. We said that there's 55 wars going on in the world, and that's threat of many more to become true. But the proposition team did not engage at all with this. And when we stated that the General Assembly that they're defending wouldn't have any power of executiveness to actually act in this war, they defended the General Assembly by completely ignoring the fact that the General Assembly cannot act in this war as it has not held executive power. So the proposition team actually brought about during their debate a proposal that cannot happen in this war, as it would make it full of wars and a much worse war. Secondly, I would like to say that they brought about in their team line that the UN Security Council is not an effective organ as the 5 permanent states held the right to have the veto on some of the resolution proposed in the Council. But first of all, I would like to refuse that by saying that in many occasions, and as we stated, the UN Security Council actually acted and helped the populations during wars, not only by the intervention of the military intervention of the peacekeepers, but also with humanitarian help. This is a huge help in wars, and if we were to abolish the Security Council, this would be completely forgotten. In fact, they did not engage at all with the problem of the peacekeepers, as the General Assembly that they're defending would not be in the power of sending the peacekeepers in the places of war. So just a moment. The General Assembly that they're defending wouldn't meet the UN goal, which is to abolish war in maintenance of peace. And if the General Assembly does not have the executive power, they cannot send the peacekeepers to act in this war and put an end on it. Yes?
Even though they can directly send peacekeepers, they still make recommendations. A lot of, and basically every country agrees on. So they will still find a way to solve this conflict thanks to their help and aid.
I'm afraid that's not true. As we said, the decision of the General Assembly are approved by 2/3 of the member states. But I would also like to say that for important matters, the decision taken by the UN General Assembly are only approved by 2/3 of the General Assembly to be passed. So there will still leave us with 1/3 of the General Assembly that is not does not agree with the resolution. And do you think that the member states that do not agree with the resolution are the one actually involved? Do you think that if if a country is starting a war with another one, and the General Assembly would propose a resolution for the war to be interrupted, the country that declared war would accept that? I don't think so. So they wouldn't. Just a moment. So they wouldn't actually meet the decision of the Security Council, even though it has passed with 2/3 of the consensus. Yes.
The problem is that the state involved doesn't agree with the resolutions, the decisions taken by the General Assembly. What if the state involved is one of the 5 permanent members and just gives the veto?
Okay, concerning the veto, I would like to bring to the judges another important matter that was ignored by proposition team, and that is that yes, the five permanent states hold the veto power, but since we do not want to abolish the UN as a total organization, I would like to bring to your attention that without the veto power, the whole UN would collapse. What the proposition team failed to recognize is that when the UN Security Council was created, the five permanent member states were the one that held the most power among the other countries of the world, and they stated that without the veto power, they would not be part of the UN. This is crucial because if we were to remove the veto power and so to abolishing the UN Security Council, the whole organization would collapse as the five permanent member states would not be part of it, so it would be extremely weak. And to support that, I would also like to bring to your attention that the five permanent member states that held the veto power are still the most influential one. For example, no, thank you. A document posted by the Stockholm International Peace Research Organization states that the most influential countries in the military matter are USA, China and Russia, which are three of the five member states that held the veto power. This means that if they were to be removed from the right they possess now, they would be detached from the UN, they would leave the UN, and the UN would become weak, and the General Assembly, without these member states, wouldn't be effective at all, because these are the most influential states in the military area. So they the UN would not meet its main goal, which is the maintenance of peace, because the states that are the most influential in the military area would not be part of the UN. I would also like to refuse a point that was brought about by the first speaker of the proposition team, which is the fact that the UN Security Council is not democratic. When I asked the first speaker if she knew the actual meaning of democracy, which is the representation of the will of the population, she agreed with me. So they do acknowledge that democracy is the representation of the will of the population. That makes the UN General Assembly also not democratic. That is because the UN General Assembly is only made of ambassadors which represent the political power, not the will of the population. So even the value they're defending, which is democracy, would not be achieved through their proposal. But our proposal to maintain the Security Council would still present a world where the UN has executive power and has the power to act in wars and to maintain the peace, which is its main goal. Thank you for the attention. I finished my speech.
My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon again. I'm here to do the reply speech now, and I would like to start with the main point of clash which emerged during this debate. The role of the UN and how, for the proposition team, it is a useless organ because it is blocked, because it fails most of the time, because they did not acknowledge and they did not appreciate what has actually been done. They only want to rely on an organ which discusses the General Assembly. They only want to rely on an organ which does not have the power to save all those millions of deaths which they believed would have been saved without the Security Council. But the General Assembly is not in any position to do so. And in fact, in this way, with relying on the General Assembly, no lives would be saved, because the General Assembly is not the organ which we can rely on to do do something, but only to discuss. And in fact, we believe that the Security Council, we demonstrated that the Security Council is still something. It may have been blocked sometimes, but it still did something. It still offered help during all the cruel wars which have been, which happened all during the years, all throughout the history. So without the Security Council, we would miss the only global governance we need to actually live a good life and to actually be safe in this world. And the second point of clash was about representativeness. In fact, for the proposition team, the Security Council is too small and doesn't represent all the countries in the world. But we demonstrated that the rotating countries which are elected represent all the continents. And so, in this way, the Security Council is as well a representative and tries to pursue the interests of the world in order to maintain international peace and to maintain international security. And this leads to one problem of the Security Council, which was discussed by both teams, the veto power. For the proposition team, the veto power only allows the 5 permanent countries to pursue their interest and therefore to impede the action of the Security Council. But we demonstrated that it is actually a protection. It is a protection from corruption. It is a protection from the subtle buying of other countries' votes. It is a protection from following the interests of the other countries but not knowing it because the countries are bought. And in this way, they demonstrated that the best case scenario in which the General Assembly will finally agree on every resolution and all the resolution will be followed is still worse than our worst case scenario, so in which the UN Security Council does not work and does not do nothing. Because what we want to pursue, what we want to achieve is security, is peace and is safety. And we want to have the security that even though a war breaks out, we can obtain humanitarian support, we can obtain help from this global governance, from this international organization. And in fact, for this reason, we agree with the second UN Secretary General. He said that the UN was not created to save humanity, to take mankind to heaven, but to save humanity from hell. And this is exactly what the Security Council is doing. In our case, the Security Council is the one which can save us from chaos, from wars, from corruption. So it can save us from hell. Thank you for listening.
May I start? Thank you. So my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. All right. My job as the reply speaker is to crystallize this debate, show the main points of clash that have emerged, and show the 2 words that have been created from our argumentations. Now, I want to highlight 3 main points of clash. The first one is the veto power really acceptable? The second is, what guarantees true peacekeeping? And the third one is, what promotes actual representation? Now, to answer the first point of clash, we want to argue that the veto power is not acceptable because it puts a couple of countries on a pedestal when the whole point of the United Nations is to work together, is to strive for cooperation. But this authority of the veto power and its power over the others does not guarantee this balance. Now, our second point, what guarantees instead true peacekeeping? A broader action in view does. And the General Assembly promotes this broader view, where whereas the view of the Security Council is still a limited one, a view that only thinks about a couple of states' personal interests and allies, without really thinking about the security of the entire world, a world that is represented by the General Assembly. Which brings us to a third point. The best way to actually promote true representation is to encourage and support the authority of the General Assembly. The General Assembly includes all 193 nations that are part of the UN. Because of this, it encourages a large confrontation between different parties and between everyone. The word they have presented is a word that is undemocratic, dangerous, to focus on a few countries, and that promotes conflicts and personal interests. Our word instead, the word of the proposition, promotes a word that is more balanced. Our core value is democracy, is equality. We want to strive for a world where everyone can make their voice heard, without a couple of countries having more benefits than the others, without this bias towards a couple of more apparently influential countries, when everyone around the world deserves the same chance of speaking up, of voting, or expressing themselves, and deserves to be listened. It does not have to be inferior to a couple of ones, because that is the whole point of democracy, of making sure that each and every person's voice is heard and taken into account. We want to strive for a world where shared policy making is fundamental, and always remember as something to take into account when we want to promote peace, because this is also what we're trying to promote, actual peacekeeping and security. But just a couple of countries that are biased and think about themselves cannot possibly truly guarantee this. Every country needs a chance to make an effort and play their part in the general and broader view of the bigger picture of peacekeeping. And the only way to do so is if these countries are able to reach a consensus, a state where they can all agree on something and together find a resolutions to nowadays problems and the problems that have emerged in the past. Only this will guarantee a safe, secure, democratic future based on shared power for everyone, where everyone can feel safe and listened to. With that, I conclude my speech.